Hey everyone, I just played Labyrinth of the Demon King, and it left me wanting more. Developed by J.R. Hoodapole, apologies if I mispronounce that, and published by Top Hat Studios, it's a survival horror game with a crunchy retro style, inspired by games like King's Field and Condemned Criminal Origins, set in Feudal Japan. And if that sounds like a winning formula, it is. You can feel the love and nostalgia for the game's inspirations bleeding through the pixels as much as you can smell the mold growing on the castle walls. But I was never a big player of either of those series. Instead, Labyrinth of the Demon King hooked me with its vibes and its combat. For the first few hours, it was a 10 out of 10 experience. I loved it, but eventually the game's shine did begin to wane, so let's talk about why. But before I get my hands into the guts of this game, I just want to disclose that the publisher provided a key for me to play Labyrinth of the Demon King early, but I am not being paid for the video, and it did not affect my opinion. What it does mean is all the information in this video is based on a pre-release version of the game, and may be subject to change. Indeed, some of the things I talk about may have already been patched by the time you see this review, so please keep that in mind. Instead, this video and everything I make on the channel is now made possible by the people generously supporting me on Patreon. I don't make money off ads, and I don't take sponsorships. So if you like what I do and want to see more, please consider donating. But if you can't support monthly or just don't want to give Patreon money, Ko-Fi is also an option. And if financial support isn't possible but you still want to help the channel out, please like and subscribe if you haven't already, and share it around because YouTube sure won't. Anyway, let's get to it. This is Labyrinth of the Demon King. The game offers very little setup. You're an unnamed Ashigaru in Feudal Japan, armed with only your broken katana and a thirst for blood, out to avenge your lord, who laid down his life to save yours when he was betrayed and slain by the titular Demon King. There is a little more to the writing, but I'll save that for now because it's simply not the focus. Labyrinth of the Demon King is a game built on vibes, and they are immaculate. The castle in which the game is set feels trapped in its rot, in the process of decaying but never quite allowed to truly die. There's corruption everywhere you look, and the lack of detail offered by the low poly visual style lets the imagination run wild, filling in the blanks, adding mold to the walls, smearing grime across the shoji doors, fraying the tapestries and choking the air thick with the stench of rot. I can't remember the last time I've encountered a game able to make me feel hot or cold, but the storm rolling through the castle's courtyards had me shivering in my seat, as much as the stale, humid air of the bathhouse had me sweating. The enemies look just as run down and rotten, trapped in the same cycles of decay, left with nothing but the rags fused to their putrefying skin and the few rusty weapons left to salvage. The kingdom trapped in an era of rot has become a pretty common setting in video games over the past decade thanks to the popularity of titles like Dark Souls, but I don't think I've ever come across one so fouled, and yet so mundane. Magic might exist in this setting, your enemies are yokai right out of Japanese mythology after all, but they feel like scavengers drawn to the place and corrupted by its bad vibes more than as an aspect of the world that was always present. There are a bunch of hidden passages and strange secrets to discover around the labyrinth, but they're all the sorts of things you might actually find in an old Japanese castle. Even when the game dives right into supernatural horror in its later areas, the environments and level layouts stay anchored to reality in ways that only heighten the dissonant effect. An oversized private bath for the oversized Demon King, a prison complex where sacrifices are packed like sardines into tiny cells, a mess hall overrun with rot, which I think contrasts really well with the overtly supernatural journey you take to reach the labyrinth in the game's opening moments. In fact, the whole sequence was so effective, I'm not even going to show it. I think it should be experienced firsthand as a player, rather than passively through a YouTube video or a trailer. And it's not the only horror moment in the game like that either. The labyrinth doesn't just look dead, it feels empty, the same way Silent Hill feels empty, because everyone who could leave already did the second they were able. The castle may have once been a real place, but it's like the weight of the Demon King's corruption sent it crashing through reality down into hell, and now there it sits, rotting, waiting for the next person foolish enough to seek it out and join the filth. It helps that the game has some fantastic sound design to support the tone. The music isn't just oppressive, it's disturbing. There are tracks that incorporate groans and gurgles. Or take traditional Japanese music and turn it into something nightmarish. And the Foley work was great. Like any good survival horror game, Labyrinth of the Demon King uses enemy vocalizations to let you know when they're around, even when you can't see them, but just as often they'll go quiet to lie in ambush, or their cries will be drowned out by other ambient sounds. It's not uncommon to come across something happening behind a locked door that will only serve to distract you while a more immediate threat runs up to cave your skull in. And speaking of skulls, there's one enemy whose arrival is always heralded by the tolling of a bell, and every time I heard it ringing, it sent me into a frenzy to finish any fight and get out of the area by any means necessary as quickly as I could. I can't say the game ever scared me, but there were moments where, thanks to the audio work, I did feel pretty unnerved, and maybe even a little panicked. Even the friendly NPCs sound like demons if you actually stop for a chat. Though they've got just enough vitality left in them to stop them from coming off as too disturbing. It's such great presentation, I was genuinely shocked to discover this game had been made in Unreal Engine 5. I didn't know UE5 games were allowed to have an actual visual style. It's really impressive stuff, especially for such a small developer. But good as the presentation is, there are a couple of problems. The game has a very strong opening, but it's ruined a little by the tutorial where you can not only see enemies spawn in despite the cuts to black, but have to put up with all sound pausing every time you pick up an item, which, for a first impression, was very jarring and very off-putting. To the point I almost wish the game didn't have a tutorial at all, because the opening sequence is so much better in every way. There were other minor things like an enemy getting extruded through some furniture after a bad fall, and the way the rain always took a moment to kick in every time I exited the castle. and the fact the note screen looked a bit too modern compared to the retro style of everything else, but they didn't almost ruin the experience for me like the issues with the tutorial did. I also wish there was a bit more variety to the environments and the enemies. Everywhere felt run down and rotten in the same way, and most of the enemies were just humanoid weirdos. The game's short enough that it wasn't a deal breaker, but it did stand out. But easily the most memorable aspect of the presentation was the cinematics. These things feel authentically old school, not as though they were designed with the style in mind, but as if they leaped right out of the 1990s. The pixelation, the audible crunch, even just the cinematography, they are perfect, and using them to mimic old Resident Evil-esque door transitions was just the icing on the cake. Chef's kiss. It's not just the loading screens that evoke 90s Resident Evil. Labyrinth of the Demon King has a very classic survival horror level design that absolutely nailed the vibe. The Tower of Repetition especially had a very intricate puzzle box layout with locked doors and secret passages and side areas that flowed together really well. Areas often looped around on each other, but in a way that usually minimized backtracking. Finding new items generally led to a passageway to guide you around to where you'd actually need them. I never found myself lost or frustrated by a lack of indication of where to go or what to do. Labyrinth of the Demon King kept things moving. Even when all I stumbled onto was a secret, it always felt like a reward just to see more of the world, though the weapons and upgrade items were a nice bonus, especially in the early game where you really need the extra stamina. Combat is where Labyrinth of the Demon King really breaks from the old school survival horror formula. It's stamina management and keeping the rhythm rather than positioning that's the focus here. You have 5 options in total: 2 attacks, light and heavy, 2 defenses, parry and dodge, and a kick that's sort of both at once. You can chain these together as combos. For example, if you parry an enemy attack, you can then follow through with a light riposte, and each weapon has its own set of moves to learn too. For example, a katana might follow up a parry with a slash, but if you're using a club, you'll just shove the enemy back a step. Most enemies have the same moveset, they can even parry, but a heavy attack or a quick kick will blast right through their defense. And if you accidentally hit them with a light attack anyway, a quick dodge will avoid their own following riposte. Something that I really loved about Labyrinth of the Demon King's combat is that a single dodge doesn't cost stamina. It's only if you try to chain them together in quick succession that they'll drain the bar, which I think is a really fun way to reward efficient play. It's the same with running. It doesn't cost stamina, but the bar won't refill while you're moving either, so you can't just bug out of a fight and come back once you've taken a break. The game wants you to stay in the middle of things, and while that can be overwhelming, especially at first, it's never chaotic. All the enemies have really well telegraphed attacks, and overall the combat felt very fair. If you ever do lose the rhythm of a fight, you will get bullied into the grave, but I never got the sense that I was taking cheap damage. Even fights against multiple enemies felt fair. In fact, they could get quite intense and more engaging than battles with single opponents. I think it helps that enemies aren't just out to get you, they're out to get each other, and it's not uncommon to come across a couple of yokai battling it out, or a pile of corpses and pickups on the floor where you missed an earlier off-screen ruckus. It was always fun to let them fight and then clean up the winner, but it was even better to watch enemies turn on each other while trying to get at you. I did have some issues with enemies that stayed low to the ground, like these lantern lads or the fucking bugs. Actually, you know what? Fuck the bugs. I hate the bugs. I'd be minding my own business and suddenly get poisoned out of nowhere by one of the little shits. The toxic shock stacks too. Fucking trench rat ass enemies. Anyway, yes, I never quite got the rhythm for the fights with the shorter enemies, and I can't tell if that's me or if there's an actual balance issue, but they were certainly more challenging than any other yokai in the game. Part of it I think has to do with the kick, since it will turn into a stomp depending on how low you're aiming, which is great fun when you're not in combat, but when you stomp when you want to kick, or kick when you want to stomp, it can mean getting hit with poison or bleed from tiny baby enemies, and that is really really annoying. Maybe I was just using the wrong weapon type. Labyrinth of the Demon King has a lot of different weapons to choose from, but what really matters is what sort of damage they deal out. There are 3 main damage types: slashing, piercing, and blunt force. And from the information provided in the notes, it seems like every enemy is weak to one. For example, the Bone Brigade is said to be weak to hammers and clubs, but won't take much damage from piercing weapons like a naginata. I mean, why would it? You'd just poke the air between its ribs. But I never found it to be particularly true. Upgrade a weapon enough times, and it'll kill anything regardless of enemy strengths or weaknesses. Enemies did occasionally throw out a super fast riposte before the Ashigaru's clunky ass could dodge or parry. The Lantern lads were really bad for this, but I don't know if that's because I was using the wrong weapon type against them, or if they're just like that. Overall, the system does discourage sticking to one weapon, and I did have a lot of fun testing out all the different options on offer because the variety is great, but it wasn't enough to keep me from playing favourites. I still ended up choosing a main weapon for most of the game, Great Dao, my beloved. It's one of the weapons you can only get through combining a couple of parts scattered across the world. In fact, there are a bunch of secret or craftable blades to find that I'll try not to spoil here. You can buy even more from the cat in the tea house too, so you're spoiled for choice as far as weapons go. But while the Great Dao was my main, and the Naginata was a late game favourite for clearing out those fucking bugs, the objectively best weapon type has to be ranged. Bow, gun, doesn't matter. If you rock up to a fight with anything to put some distance between you and the enemies, there's nothing they can do unless they've got one as well, which made the skeleton archers in the prison area the most dangerous enemies in the game, but also trivialized the boss fights because they don't know what to do if you rock up and start blasting. Even before I discovered how completely broken ranged combat is, the boss fights were a bit of a letdown. They're hyped up as big events with their own cinematics, and they have great designs, but mechanically, they always felt like regular enemies with health bars. In fact, I found a couple were even easier than some regular enemies, and that's if you choose to fight them fairly with a melee weapon. One of them couldn't hit me at all because it was so big I kept clipping into it the whole fight. Even the final boss can be completely cheesed by running up onto a platform at the back of the arena. I don't think it helps that you can just leave the boss fights if you want to, and unlike regular enemies, they can't really follow you. The only exception was the Ubume, the first boss, which actually did feel like a proper battle, but I wonder if that's more because I was still pretty underpowered at that point in the game. The first area overall felt quite engaging in terms of the combat, but not challenging, if that makes sense. In fact, for a title that bills itself as a dark and gritty survival horror game, it was shockingly easy. I think I only died about 5 or 6 times across my whole first playthrough, and one of those was self-inflicted looking for secrets down a bottomless hole. The rest were caused by status effects, specifically Rot, which just kills you instantly if it hits 100, but regular combat never actually got me. I always had enough consumables to top up health and stamina, or remove status effects, and enemies always dropped enough money that I could resupply over at the tea house the second I returned anyway. I never even really used the talismans other than to test them out for the sake of the review, and I'm glad I didn't, because they would have reduced the difficulty even more if I had. And if you do happen to die, it's never much of a setback since you're just taken to the last save shrine with all your items and progress intact, which is surprisingly kind. Though, just because it's easy and fair doesn't mean it can't be cruel. There is a limit on how many consumables you can carry, and it has a habit of spawning bugs in boxes at the absolute worst fucking moments, like here, right after a boss fight. But even so, it still wasn't that much of a challenge, and that's really my biggest problem with Labyrinth of the Demon King. It doesn't escalate. As with the presentation, you see pretty much everything the game has to offer mechanically in the first area. Once you level out of the difficulty range, it doesn't add layers of complexity to the combat to offset the rise in player skill. It stays the same while you become unstoppable. And I suppose now I should mention the same is true of the level design. I loved the layout of the Tower of Repetition, but the second I reached the Tower of Lamentation, it, and every subsequent area, began to fall into old level design traps. Lots of backtracking for puzzles, fewer shortcuts to reduce travel time, less guidance on where to go, a greater density of enemies, and as a result, the game lost me a bit. I should also mention now that enemies respawn, which I didn't really mind. It keeps exploration interesting, and they drop loot, so even if you take a couple of hits, you can buy the health back from the shop with the money they leave behind. But there are certain rooms in the mid to late game that are just so busy with bad guys that they're not fun to go through, which is a problem, because you have to, a lot. The mid to late game also felt a little less polished than the Tower of Repetition too. I did maybe kill a couple of enemies through walls in the early game, but I still felt underpowered enough by that point that it seemed like a way to get one up over Labyrinth of the Demon King. I can't say the same about the enemies in the bathhouse or the prison who just didn't want to fight. That just felt like a weird bug. They would retaliate if provoked, but otherwise they just stood around chilling. This happened consistently to enemies who spawned in this specific cell in the prison, so I don't know what that was about. There was also a time where two enemies were fighting, and when I killed the first, the other ran like halfway around the map to set up an ambush, and then died the second I looked at it funny. Which was probably not intended, but it was entertaining. And that's sort of the problem with the combat in these sorts of horror games. It's hard to maintain a spooky atmosphere when the enemies are left up to their own devices to such a degree. There were still moments of intensity when I ended up caught by surprise or trapped between two enemies or pursued by the bellboy, but they weren't really scary. Like most games, Labyrinth of the Demon King did its best horror in curated, scripted segments. The second the fighting began, all that went right out the window. I would have liked more NPC interactions too. You meet a bunch of them early on moving about the world, but after a while they all just move over to the tea house and turn into merchants. The merchant, even. Which brings me to the story, what little the game has. It's here that Labyrinth of the Demon King leans much closer to Kingsfield than Condemned Criminal Origins. The NPCs don't offer much insight into what's going on, and like I just mentioned, they don't participate much in the plot once they move over to the tea house to act as vendors. But what they do bring up does paint a pretty vile picture of the situation. It's probably the most effective world building in the game, especially the servant's comments about how she came to be trapped in the labyrinth. But it's still only surface level stuff, and I wish there was more, because the character work here is already really fun. I want to see more of the cat and the cuppa sorting their shit out, or the servant finding a way to escape the castle, but alas, this is all we get. Most of the documents you can find are just the usual survival horror fluff describing upcoming enemies or bosses and how to defeat them, or descriptions of the 8 hells, 4 of which, incidentally, correspond to the 4 towers of the labyrinth. A precious few actually give some insight into what happened to the castle before it ended up this way, but it's so vague that I think even the most unrepentant of lore goblins would struggle to build anything substantial out of it. A soldier worries about the, admittedly unchecked, outbreak of mold in the barracks. A monk wonders why he's been allowed to keep his helmet despite being locked up. There are rumours that the Lord lies with a demon, or with boys, and really? That's where we're going with this? A bit tired, don't you think? Especially when that's the only thing we definitely learn about the Lord of the Castle. That, and he keeps locking people up to torture them. The writing is so vague that I'm not even sure if the Lord of the Castle and the Demon King are meant to be the same person, or if the Lord of the Castle became the Demon King through his actions, or how the son of the Lord who was caught by a farmer in bed with a boy, as mentioned in part of a puzzle, factors into any part of this. The Demon King's comments before your final confrontation with him just raises more questions, and the ending resolves none of them. And while I can find evidence in the text that supports a less homophobic interpretation of what's going on, it is just an interpretation. One question I had about Labyrinth of the Demon King right from the start was, why are we here? Why is our unnamed Ashigaru putting himself through so much to avenge his lord? I'm sure sure honor plays some part in it, but at the same time, why would his lord give up his life to save some random soldier? Comments made across the game imply a deeper connection, and eventually I began to wonder if maybe the lord sacrificed his life to save the Yashigarus out of love, and our mission to slay the Demon King is to avenge our fallen partner. Again, this is just an interpretation, and I mostly came upon it to balance out the lord being an alleged boyfucker, but I think there is evidence here to support it. There's just as much evidence to support the whole thing being some sort of mental breakdown on the Yashigaru's part too. If you arrive at the Demon King's chambers without having restored your katana, he'll gloat about how the other half is still buried in your lord's belly, and whether you take the game literally or metaphorically, that still means your own blade was used to slay your lord, and I don't even know where to begin with that. For all I know, the game could be the Yashigaru working up the nerve to commit Sudoku after killing their lord in the middle of an assault, and god I hope it isn't, because that wouldn't just be a really shitty story, it would engage with a trope that I fucking hate, the whole thing being a dream. There's so much bedroom imagery from the main menu to the final boss arena that it feels relevant, but overall there's just so little plot to begin with that lore goblin interpretations are really all there is to talk about. Like everything to do with Labyrinth of the Demon King, there's no escalation. You don't learn anything about the character you're playing as, or the world you're playing in, beyond surface level information. Nobody has any depth, nobody goes through any sort of arc, and the one twist the game does hit you with is mechanical rather than narrative in nature. And that does tie into the general vibe of stagnancy and decay, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it doesn't fit well into a survival horror game, especially one styled after the classics, which did usually include a lot more plot, such as it was. It's possible I'm missing something, but either way, it's rare that a game has left me so confused about whether I even finished it or not. I feel like I accidentally stumbled my way into the bad ending, and that there's like a whole other half to the game where you go through the 4 unseen hells mentioned in the notes to confront the real Demon King. I felt so strongly about this that I actually went looking for it. There's an area of the basement in the Tower of Repetition where you can place 4 statues into 4 pillars surrounding the grave of a princess, another aspect of the backstory that's not really elaborated upon, and I was never able to find a single one, and I looked. I went over every area of the game with a fine-toothed comb, and found some wild shit that I won't spoil, but I never found a statue to place in these pillars. I thought that shouldn't be possible. The game draws such specific attention to them on the map, and even gives you the option to interact with them. I even asked the press guy at Top Hat who reached out to me with the key if there's a way to find them, because I was so certain that half the game was hidden behind these stupid pillars. But when they got back to me, they confirmed the whole thing was just an Easter egg referencing an earlier iteration of the game, so I don't know, maybe it'll be released as DLC or something. I was so lost in the labyrinth, I even had theories about how to find the statues. There are 4 NPCs. You get a brief moment to interact with them before they retreat to the neutral zone of the tea house. Maybe you get the statues by killing them. So I tried, and the cat beat my ass, just fucking wrecked my shit, and even when I cheesed the fight by jumping on top of some furniture, no amount of damage seemed to kill the thing, so I guess that's a bust. It was funny how the cat was still willing to trade with me in the middle of the fight though, so at least I got a giggle out of it, but I don't know. Maybe they're a hardcore mode only sort of deal, assuming hardcore mode is even in the game. I don't know that for sure either, but I definitely think the game should have a hardcore mode for players like me who found the challenge a little lacking. Labyrinth of the Demon King just left me with a really weird feeling. I beat the game, but I don't feel like I finished it, and I don't know if I walked away feeling like I got an incomplete experience because I played a pre-release version, or if I missed something big, or if the game is just what it appears to be on the surface, which is, unfortunately, quite shallow. There are other weird things too, like how the training room you can access from the main menu is part of the tea house map. You can snatch items through its open window and see the lever you can pull to spawn enemies on the inside, but you can never enter the building in general gameplay, and that's probably because the place is a neutral weapons-free zone, but it's it's still odd. And that's another nitpick actually. It is a little annoying having to re-equip everything after travelling to and from the tea house. But probably the biggest example of how Labyrinth of the Demon King ends too soon ironically occurs very early in the game. It's part of the opening horror sequence, so I won't give specifics. But there is a very hungry boy who appears early on, and he's great. He's creepy as fuck, and the whole game I kept waiting for him to come back as a boss fight, or in another horror sequence, or even as the Demon King's true form, but he never did. I said at the start of this video that Labyrinth of the Demon King left me wanting more, because there just wasn't enough of it. Not enough variety to the environments, not enough complexity to the mechanics, not enough depth to its plot or its characters, not enough scripted horror sequences. I went into the game blind, and I'm glad I did, because while checking trailers and screenshots on the Steam store page to see if there was anything I hadn't encountered, I discovered there is very little left for the player to find on their own. They show off every area, every enemy, every boss, every weapon type, and if I'd played Labyrinth of the Demon King having consumed the promotional material, I'd be pretty disappointed that there wasn't more to it. What's here is a good baseline, and in the early game, like I said, it was a 10 out of 10 experience. For the first 3 hours, I was fucking hooked. I was fucking engaged. But once I leveled out of the difficulty range, the game never rose to meet me, nor did it really present me with anything as new or exciting as the first area again. I still got 9 hours out of Labyrinth of the Demon King, and I'd still recommend it if you're a survival horror fan, because it evokes the classics of the genre with an authenticity I haven't seen since games like Alyssa or Signalis. But if you're looking for complex combat mechanics or extreme difficulty, Labyrinth of the Demon King probably won't scratch that itch, or at least it didn't for me. Still, I enjoyed my time with it. I think it's really impressive for a first-time indie dev, and I look forward to seeing what they do next, whether it's a continuation of the Labyrinth or something entirely new. It may not have been exactly what I wished it was the whole way through, but you know what they say, always leave them wanting more. Thanks for watching. And that's the video. Before I go, I'd like to thank by name the people supporting me with $5 US a month or more on Patreon. Open parentheses, Borat Hacking Voice, close parentheses, I am in, my wife, Azazel, Cass, Derek Waterbury, Hawkwing2652, Heymatey, Jeffiet, Marcy May, Operator Error, Paranoid Android, Sminglis, Sarah Bloomer, Smorsky, Sneezy McGlassface, Space Quest Historian, This Sauerkraut, Tree 3 Angry Bees, Ursa, and Zeke the Phantom. Thank you so much. So this was a sudden surprise project even for me. I don't normally cover recent releases so quickly, but it was nice to make something short and sweet without a deadline for a change. And it was fun, so hey, what the hell. Anyway, the next video is going to be that gardening I promised last time, unless I get my act together enough to finish off the Dino Horror project, in which case, it'll be that instead. We'll see how it goes. Anyway, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.
Double kill.